The reign of Catherine the Great may be the greatest one Russia has ever seen, since this girl went to work the moment she got the throne. From expanding the empire by taking massive chunks out of Poland and the Ottoman Empire, which then helped turn Russia into a great power of Europe at the time, as well as bringing some Enlightenment principles into Russian culture, causing a renaissance of art and knowledge all throughout their country. So long as you weren't a serf, of course. She didn't really do much to help them at all. But besides all that, Catherine didn't always have such great power. Heck, she was actually born to a lower noble German house with very little wealth, and was luckily chosen by Queen Elizabeth of Russia to wed her heir, Peter III, who just so happened to be her cousin as well. Well, that's just a royal tradition after all, but at least now she was part of a powerful family, right? Sure, but her husband happened to be a giant man-child who was never taught any manners, and he made her life hell, from humiliating her out in public in front of other nobles, to going on drunken tirades against her, and worst of all in my opinion, forcing her to take part in his little army miniature games where he would play for hours at a time, ordering commands at Catherine while becoming increasingly more and more violent with his miniatures the longer they went on. It is this sort of behavior that led her to eventually overthrow Peter to run Russia herself, but it is also the arc of her life that I want to deep dive into today, to paint a better picture of how chaotic it was, for all you guys at home to enjoy. So let's start in the beginning, when she was first chosen after Elizabeth gave up on getting married herself. Because Elizabeth, the Queen of Russia, tried very hard herself to be wed and have children, but it was always out of her grasp. From her very first fiancé dying to smallpox when she was just 17, and then being restricted by her predecessor Anna, who made sure no nobleman could have her hand in marriage. So by the time Elizabeth got into power, her paternal clock was basically already over. So she decided to simply have her nephew, Peter III, be her rightful heir, and raise him herself, to turn him into a proper ruler one day. Okay, well, attempt, I'll say. This meant she needed to get him a wife as well, so she chose Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, aka Catherine II, aka Catherine the greatest of all time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Sophie, at the age of 15, would arrive in Russia prepared to get the most out of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, wasting no time integrating herself into the society. Since she's been raised for this very moment, become queen of a royal family, so that her own family could finally rise out of the pits of low-tier wealth, and finally reach the status of the true upper class, aka royalty, baby. So they had Sophie learn all kinds of things to become the perfect wife for a one-day powerful ruler, learning etiquette, French, and Lutheran theology. So by the time Elizabeth decided to wed her with Peter III, Sophie was already game for this kind of opportunity to begin with. Even if she was going to have to marry her cousin, who she found to be revolting and detestable, with his sickly pale skin and his disgusting alcohol problem, which she has had since a very early age, that wasn't going to stop her from becoming queen. So by the time she arrived at the palace, she immediately got to work smoozing Elizabeth and her lover, Alexei, to get on their good side, learning Russian as fast as possible and fighting off a nasty case of psoriasis which nearly took her out. Yep, almost as soon as she got there she fell ill, but that didn't stop her at all, since she would make a full recovery that she attributes to her frequent use of bloodletting. Which, if you don't know, that's the act of letting leeches suck your blood to rebalance the humors of the body. This was something she did several times a day. I know, it's a miracle that she even survived. Hell, during the entire ordeal, her own mother wanted Sophie to confess to a Lutheran pastor, believing that she didn't have long to live. But Sophie wasn't having any of that, stating that she didn't want to confess to a Lutheran, but only an Orthodox father. Which impressed Elizabeth so much that she started to adore Sophie like a daughter. She would even give Sophie her own mother's name, Catherine, after she converted over officially to the Orthodox Church, now becoming Catherine II, and soon after, well, a whole year after, she would finally be married to Peter III at the age of 16 years old. They were moving to their own royal palace where Peter would rule as the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and the two would begin their lives as newlyweds. Sounds like quite a nice way to start off your marriage, right? But no, it was already a total mess, since Peter and Catherine never consummated their marriage. Well, at least for a few years, that is, with Peter preferring the company of mistresses over Catherine, while also showing his immature nature by harassing Catherine every chance he could, from mocking her German accent in every accidental slip of the tongue. He would often imitate her accent while drinking with his buddies just for a laugh, and even encourage others to do the same thing and tell him about it, while he would also ignore her the entire time they were out in public. He would even go as far as seating a friend between the two of them, just so he could keep his distance. He preferred to let his court spies keep an eye on her while he was out having his fun. These spies would surround Catherine at every turn, isolating Catherine from anyone who wasn't in Peter's web of eyes. But it's not like she wasn't doing anything that whole time. Catherine was still proactive as ever, and actually managed to get to know many prominent figures in the court. many of whom secretly opposed her own husband, who would also become very useful allies to her at a later time. In the meantime, she ferociously buried herself in books, reading Voltaire and many other philosophers of the French Enlightenment, while also continuing to learn Russian to work on that accent of hers. One day she read Annals by Tacitus, who in her own words caused a revolution in her teenage mind, since Tacitus understood power politics as they were and not as they should be. Being impressed with his arguments that people do not act of their own professed idealistic reasons, but instead their hidden and interested motives. While Catherine's mind was being widened with knowledge, her husband was empowering his own with the many bottles of liquor he drank every day. Yep, he would often go on drunken binges since it was a cherished pastime of his, during which he'd become far more hot-headed and shout insults to any poor soul that crossed his path. Which was often Catherine who was most afraid of him during these times, since she could never know what he might do while he was intoxicated. It didn't help that he also liked to carry around a sword while threatening to replace her with a livelier woman. She even wrote in her letters that there was always a sense of danger, of something about to break. This was especially true during his little war games with his miniatures, where he would force Catherine to take part in daily, since he kept the game right in their bedroom, just so there was no escape for her. During these games, Catherine would be forced to play as one of his soldiers, taking orders from Peter, as he used a tiny whip to give out orders, acting as some great general, while in reality, he was just a weird nerd forcing his cousin wife to watch him abuse his little toys, since he loved to punish his soldiers for displeasing him by hanging or burning them. The dude took the game way too seriously, and it was this kind of behavior that frightened Catherine every time she was forced to watch him play this game. Though she could never show it, she preferred to stand immovable as marble, to act strong while watching Peter's insanity up close. Now, even though Catherine was surrounded by threats everywhere, she still somehow managed to obtain a lover of her own. A man by the name of Sergei Saltykov, who she honestly was just using to make Peter jealous. No, not out of some weird sense of love for Peter. She just wanted to finally consummate their marriage so she could secure her way to becoming empress one day. She still had her eye on the prize after all. However, Elizabeth would quickly discover her little side piece, so she would blackmail both Catherine and Peter into having a child together. Since Elizabeth also learned that Peter had a plot to overthrow her to ascend the throne, Elizabeth wanted a child from them to make sure that she could raise and then crown it, and not them. Not the best idea if you ask me, especially since she kind of already tried that with Peter, and well, look at how that guy came out. But they did as she told them, and Catherine gave birth to a boy named Paul, who was taken from her immediately after being born. Catherine only had very brief meetings with him while Elizabeth was alive. Though after giving Elizabeth what she wanted, Catherine was allowed to have as many liaisons as she wanted, many of which were high military officials who shared a common distaste for Peter and Elizabeth, and were even planning to oppose them one day. Though for now, they were just her lovers. These affairs would bite her in the butt though when she became pregnant again, since this time Peter wouldn't claim that child as his own, believing that Catherine got knocked up by one of her many lovers. Even though the last one was likely not his as well, however, due to his suspicions, Peter would go on a tangent against Catherine, calling her out, pushing her to her very limits until she was completely fed up with him and told him to go to hell, right in front of everyone out in public. She then immediately ran to her private room, locked it, and shut herself in to protect herself from Peter's abuse. Even worse though, the child she was pregnant with would only go on to live for 14 months before passing away, sadly. A few years later, Elizabeth would pass away as well, finally allowing Peter to ascend the throne, to the position of power that he had sought for his entire life. Now he could do whatever he wanted, which terrified Catherine, since now he was openly discussing leaving her for another woman, though she wasn't the only person enraged with him after he obtained power, because the entire military and noble class was now against Peter for withdrawing Russia from the 7 Years' War and giving Prussia all of their hard-earned gains, just because Peter was a fanboy of Frederick. However, this was the opportunity Catherine has been waiting for, a chance to unite all of the different branches of Russia to overthrow the ruler to place herself in power. But she had to act fast, since she never knew when Peter was going to be finished with her. And just 6 months after Peter became emperor, Catherine's opportunity would finally arrive, when she was informed that a few of her co-conspirators were arrested by Peter for their plot to throw a coup. So she had to kick her plans into gear immediately, leaving her palace and departing for the Izmailsky Regiment, or however you pronounce this, where she delivered the greatest tear-jerking speech ever to convince the soldiers to protect her from her man-child of a husband. Afterwards, she would rush her way to the Semenovsky barracks, where the clergy were waiting to obtain her as the sole occupant of the Russian throne, thus crowning her the Empress of Russia. With her new status, she would immediately arrest her husband and force him to abdicate his position, leaving no one to dispute her ascension to the throne. Though just 8 days after this, Peter would die in Ropshaw, probably by the hands of Alexei Orlov, who was a co-conspirator of Catherine's. Though he claimed Peter was murdered in a drunken brawl that he got into with one of the jailers. It didn't really matter now though, because Catherine had finally achieved her dream and become Empress, and one who will be remembered throughout all of history as one of the best to ever do it.